are already seeing green shoots when it comes to economic recovery.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the second conversation in the four-part discussion series co-hosted by NewsClick and Center for Financial Accountability. In the last few months, media has been talking about rapid recovery and rapid growth for the Indian economy. This series is an attempt to interrogate those claims by questioning how much of these claims actually hold true when confronted with reality and how much of it is just a number game. What has actually recovery meant for the people and what should a meaningful recovery look like? While in the first session we looked at several of these numbers and claims, in the second session titled Evaluating the Government's Steps Towards Recovery, we will evaluate each of the government's supposed steps towards propelling this recovery. From Atmanirbhar Bharat to the proposed infrastructure drive, from the reforms to the monetization of assets, we will try to confront the claims with reality and reason. On 6th of December, we will discuss what has recovery actually meant for the people, and on 10th December, we will be discussing what should have a people-centric recovery meant. This series is being moderated by Paranjoy Guha Thakurta. He is a senior journalist. His main areas of interest are the working of political economy and the media, on which he has written extensively and has also made documentary films. He is a teacher, anchor, speaker, interviewer, and writer. He has served as the editor of Economic and Political Weekly and has been a consultant with NewsClick. We are thankful that he has agreed to anchor this series with us. Given the demagoguery and high decibels in the newsrooms, we have been turned into a country lives lives in a short burst and even shorter memories. The hardships of the lockdown, the complacency and the debacle of handling the handling the second wave, the bodies floating in the rivers and the migrants on the streets are already being erased from public memory, while economic policies are geared towards favoring big capital. In such a context, this series is a part of our efforts under Economy Pe Charcha aimed at allowing more public discussion around the issues of finance that touch each of our pockets and prospects. Now I hand over the stage to Paranjoy for his initial remarks, for introducing the panelists today, and for taking the discussion forward.
Thank you very much, Ashish, for that introduction. And I think you have very succinctly and articulated the theme of this four-part series of discussions. I want to thank the Center for Financial Accountability and NewsClick for putting it together. And it's really it's important that those who are viewing, those who are listening to our speakers, get to know the facts, get to analyze and interpret the facts in a manner which is different from what is being claimed officially by the government of India, by different ministries and departments of the government of India, its ministers and its spokespersons. And I think it's very important to interrogate the rationale behind these grand schemes that have been announced. Example, 2020, middle of 2020, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, when there was widespread criticism that the government was not spending enough to provide relief to not just migrant workers, but the poor of this country when the COVID pandemic had peaked. She announced this grand plan in a series of installments, which is 20 lakh crore And that was supposed to be like 10% of India's gross domestic product, because everybody is saying, look how much these different countries are spending, look how much the United States is spending, and we are spending a pittance. But when one started looking into those figures, you found that the new part of it was just about 2 lakh crores. So instead of 20 lakh crores, it was 1/10 of that amount. That was additional, that was new. And everything else was recycling of the old schemes and existing schemes. Now the government has announced some grand plans of privatizing public sector undertakings, as well as the national monetization pipeline, which is intended to allow the private sector to lease assets and monetize assets that belong to the public sector. So we are going to start with looking at these three broad issues, and we'll go deeper into some of the specific areas: production linked incentive schemes, support to small, medium enterprises. We're going to look at different sectors, including the foreign direct investment policies of this government, and a whole lot of other issues. So let me quickly introduce the panelists who are here with me on this panel. We have a senior economic journalist, and we have two professors. I'm very happy to welcome V. Sridhar. He's a senior economic journalist. He's been following these issues very, very closely for more than 3 decades. He has been he's been actually a part of the Hindu group of publications. He recently retired as associate editor of Frontline, and he's far from actually having retired. He's neither tired nor retired. He's going on, and he's writing and he's commenting, and he's been an active part of the People's Commission Against Privatization of Public Assets. He continues to write and engage on this subject. Thank you so much, Sridhar, for being with us on this occasion. And we're very happy to have with us Professor Chirashri Dashgupta. She's a professor at the Center for the Study of Law and Governance at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her areas of specialization include the political economy of institutions, economic history, institutional economics, the history of economic thought, and on these subjects, she's written extensively and teaches these subjects. And she's been writing a lot on the concerns relating to the working of the public sector in India, issues relating to big business, corporate liability, fiscal federalism, and so on. Thank you so much, Chirashri, for being a part of this discussion. And with us here is Professor Surojit Majumdar. Professor Majumdar is at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning also at JNU, the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's been very active in studying the working of the political economy, the industrialization process, the corporate sector, and questions relating to regulation, deregulation, and under policies of so-called economic liberalization. And he's also been critically evaluating the growth model under globalization. So I thank all of you. And let's really start with Sridhar, and then I'll come to Professor Chirashri Majumdar and then Professor Surojit Majumdar. And let's start with this grand plan, National Infrastructure Pipeline. And everything is supposed to be first of a kind. Everything is supposed to be like the numbers are humongous. And the most recent announcement pertains to what is called the asset monetization, the monetize NMP, the National Monetization Pipeline, which is really, and here I'm quoting the Finance Ministry from one of its official releases. It says that in the wake of COVID-19, there is a pressing need on the public outlay towards social sector priorities and economic stimuli initiatives, thereby necessitating exploring alternative mechanisms such as asset monetization with increased vigor. So the whole national monetization pipeline is being justified as enabling the government to spend on the social sector. Now, I'd like Sridhar to comment on what this is all about, the national monetization pipeline. It's listed out all the assets, the asset classes, the various infrastructure ministries, and all of these are supposed to be monetized over a period of time. So, over to you, Sridhar. Please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thank you, Paranjoy. And I'd like to thank NewsClick and the Center for Financial Accountability for having me on this show. Paranjoy, I think we need to situate this. I mean, as a journalist, we are used to using pegs, and the peg now is the GDP. And since this show is about interrogating the recovery, and I would like to look at some of the numbers that the GDP latest figures show. If you slice national GDP in across its expenditure categories, private final consumption expenditure, which is the largest portion of GDP, government final consumption expenditure, into which it's not just the running of the government, but also social security and various other schemes through which transfers payments are made, and gross fixed capital formation, which is a marker of investment. Now, if you ignore for a moment the headline numbers, which has been in the media, that's the 8.4% growth rate, and actually look at the levels of GDP prevailing in 2019-20, that is before the pandemic, then you have a better measure of whether and how far the economy has actually recovered. The reason I'm doing this, I'm aware that earlier in the other segments of this show you have looked at the numbers more closely, but the reason I'm highlighting this is that private final consumption expenditure has declined by 7.7% in the 2-year period we are talking about. Government final consumption expenditure has declined by 7.83%. Gross fixed capital formation has declined by 8.2%. That means the investment is just not picking up. It's not happening. Now, these three components account for the overwhelming proportion of your GDP, national GDP. So we are talking about a real problem. Now, the fact that capital formation has declined so significantly, so sharply, indicates a few things. It shows that. And the reason I'm citing this is to link it to the privatization and disinvestment and privatization and the monetization pipeline, in the sense that these actually are likely to subvert any worthwhile recovery that may be that can happen in the piece, and that's the potentialities of a recovery are probably being sabotaged by this. Now, I'll explain why I'm saying this. One of the ways of initiating a recovery, because private investment has not been forthcoming, and we have the finance minister just recently almost pleading with private industry to take risks and invest, and that's not happening. One of the reasons one of the ways to counter this would have been to use the potentiality of public sector undertakings to initiate a recovery, and that's not happened. Instead, we have had dividend payouts by the public sector undertakings as well as the RBI. The figures that I'm quoting includes those from the RBI as well, but they have increased from 2.4% of GDP in 2014-15 when the Narendra Modi government came to power, and now it is in 2021 it was 4.1%. So the government has been sucking out the profits of the public sector undertakings, and which have never depended really on the government budgetary support anyway, and reduce the possibilities of them plowing back investment to initiate a recovery during this pandemic. Now, that is the significance of the decline in capital formation. And so instead of using the public sector as a vehicle for a recovery, we are actually going the other way, and that's really worrying. Now the monetization pipeline, the privatization, what it does is that it results in very little additionality of investment. I mean, I'm well aware that Air India is not the typical public sector undertaking, but nevertheless, it illustrates some of the things that are problematic. And I mean, why an investment may not be forthcoming, even when it is even if it is under a private enterprise, under the control of a private company. For example, Air India. Air India is now, because the Tatas have acquired Air India, they are now in an oligopoly. The market is now, the domestic airline market is in an oligopolistic market now. Between Indigo and Air India, effectively they hold a 75% market share. Now, any elementary theory of firm, I mean, will tell you that oligopolistic behavior in terms of investment is very different from a market that is exposed to competition. So it is not as if the Tatas are going to invest heavily in the market, because they are going to look for profitability and in an oligopolistic situation. Now that is one. Secondly, even the investment that the Tatas have made, I mean, while purchasing Air India, is heavily loaded in terms of debt. Now, Air India is being sold for 18,000 crores, of which the Tatas are paying just 2,700 crores. And they are going to control 13-14% of Air India's domestic market share, including Vistara and AirAsia. They effectively control about 23%, 22-23% of the domestic market. So now the pricing power they get will not make them invest in airlines, because Air India has a much bigger fleet than these other two smaller companies that Tata has already controlled. So investment is very unlikely to come. The point that the fact that it's heavily loaded in terms of debt means that even the investment that is going to come from the banking sector. It's not going to come from the Tatas. On top of this, since debt enjoys certain very significant tax breaks, the actual revenues to the government may be even less, because there will be an outflow of revenue from the government exchequer for these tax concessions. So the point is that if you are allowing, privatization essentially is the transfer of assets, which does not necessarily result in fresh investment in new capacity. So the productive capacity in the economy is unlikely to increase significantly as a result of privatization or disinvestment, as it is politely called. Coming to the monetization pipeline, you see most of this, the government expects, the Niti Aayog's paper says 6 lakh crores worth of assets. Now, even that is not very clear. I mean, whether those are actually valued at that. I mean, when the private companies bid for these leases, whether that is going to actually materialize is something that is a very major imponderable. Even if you were to assume that it would generate, these are valued at 6 lakh crores. When a private investor takes an asset on lease, he works out the value of what is called the net present value of the returns from that investment over the lifetime of the lease. In this case, it's 25 to 30 years. Now, that will be typically, and then there is a profit margin and so on and all that. And so typically, if you ask people in the banking industry, they will tell you that it will be about only 1/4 of this value. So what is being touted as a 6 lakh crore asset leasing program, is actually going to be give not more than one. I mean, I'm assuming that this 6 lakh crore valuation will actually materialize. Even then, it's going to be only 1.5 lakh crores. Now, doing all this for what? remember this 50% of the assets that are on the block for leasing are railway and road assets. None of this, and these are what are called natural monopolies. And so none of these are what are called natural monopolies, meaning that uh, like for example, if you have a station in Chennai which is being handed over to a private contractor on a lease. Now that, I mean, it's not a competitive market in the sense that Chennai can only have have so many stations, railway stations. So effectively, you are handing over this asset over which the private investor will have monopoly control. And like for example, if Chennai Central is say privatized, what happens? There is the private investor who's taking this on a 25-year lease is unlikely to, this asset is already built. The investment that needs to be made is very likely to be just cosmetic. And
Okay.
in any case, that investor, not only is it going to be marginal, the incentive to actually invest is going to reduce over time,
All right.
because you're not interested in investing in the asset, and is also likely to flog the asset. So this is
Okay.
the
Okay, I'm interrupting you, Sridhar.
yeah.
We're going to get back to you, and you've discussed several very, very important issues. And I'd like both Professor Chirushri Dashgupta and Surajit Majumdar to comment on some of the points you made. If I can briefly summarize some of the main points you made. I mean, firstly, you said that this headline number, 8.4% GDP, is misleading because there are major decline. I mean, there is a major decline in expenditure, gross fixed capital formation, government's expenditure, private final consumption expenditure, and so on and so forth. And if I may briefly add, this is on a low base. We've discussed this in greater detail. All this is on a low base because, according to the government's own statistics, and we can dispute those statistics, in April, May, and June of 2020, India's economy shrank by almost 24%. And in the following 3 months, it shrank by another 7.5%. This has never happened in this country before. This is the
Paranjoy,
first time.
can I interrupt you for a minute? No, which is why I use the level of GDP, not the growth rates.
Correct. Absolutely correct. And we are going to get a chance to elaborate on these points. But I think, Chirushri, the main points that he made is that instead of using the public sector to ensure that the economy recovers, what Sridhar is arguing is sabotaging that recovery. That you're creating oligopolistic structures, including in the airlines business, Air India. I mean, look, you have a serving member of parliament belonging to the Bharatiya Janata Party, Dr. Subramaniam Swamy, who goes on record saying that the entire bidding process, it's not my language, but his language was quote unquote rigged. And then you have the public sector being sucked out, dividends being taken out of it. And these are really some of the main points that Sridhar has made. And I'd like you to elaborate on these points and add your observations. Over to you, Chirushri Dashgupta.
Okay, thank you. The first point I would like to make is what Sridhar said, that most of this is road transport, highways, railways. But apart from that, let's point out that there's power, there's pipeline and natural gas, there's civil aviation, there's ports and waterways, telecom, food and public distribution, mining, coal, housing, and urban affairs. So the bulk of the urban economy and a substantive bulk of the rural economy, all the public sector assets that are there are up for backdoor privatization through this thing called the National Monetization Pipeline, which essentially says it's a lease and not sale. And the so-called aim has been to, if you go through the documents, the 2 volumes that have been published on this by the Niti Aayog, is to generate employment, growth, and integration of the economy. and it's called a structured contractual partnership between the government and the private sector. And the reason it is being done, and this is where Sridhar's argument is absolutely spot on, in contrast to what is being claimed, the reason it is being done is because of the private sector's resource efficiency. Now, we have a long kind of theoretical literature which shows that this is bunkum, that there is no reason to believe that the private sector is more efficient than the public sector. There are problems about the methods of measuring efficiency, etc. Leaving those aside, now, the interesting thing is that this whole thing will be done through setting up of two trusts, the infrastructure investment trusts and real estate investment trusts. Okay. Now, who will be the trustees? What is going to be the institutional structure of these trusts? None of this is really clear, and these are going to monitor sales over short period. The terms of contract, the details of assets are not known. Yeah, as Sridhar pointed out, that valuation, where it comes from, it's not there in the documentation. So how they have arrived at it is not clear. Now, the state of infrastructure, once the period of lease is over, the period of contract is over, what is going to be the state of infrastructure? For example, Sridhar's example of the privatization, the sort of leasing of Chennai Central, and then let's say 30 years down the line, will it be like, and what will be the return reinvestment on what terms? So, without going into working out any of this, the entire project is a sort of a big um, is ambitious but suffers from short-termism. That's the first thing to say. Okay. Now, I'm not going into the arguments against privatization at the moment because, as you said, we will do it separately. But as Sridhar says, I completely agree with his numbers. According to my calculations, in the 4-year period that they are projecting 6 lakh crores, it is not even going to be 1.1% of GDP, what we are going to get back in terms of the return. So this is an overestimate, because if GDP grows at the rates that are being claimed, then it will be even less. So this is just turning all public sector assets into commodities without really having any kind of planning or vision about what is going to be the use and utility and value of those assets. Okay. Now, on the other hand, what I would like to point out, and this also comes out from Sridhar's figures about final consumption, that demand contraction has been the main feature of this entire period of crisis. And it is not just the last 3 years. This is something that is much longer. For almost a decade now, demand has been contracting in India. And under such and if there is this kind of a privatization through sort of leasing of assets, the first thing that will happen is that user charges will go up, profit margins will be increased, as Sridhar pointed out, and there will be shift from wages to profits. There are likely to be cuts in employment. So employment in the public sector is going to go down. And all of this will mean that it will further reinforce the demand contraction that is already there. Apart from that, the other point that I wish to bring in terms of political economy is that this is fundamentally anti-democratic, because it is fundamentally anti-federalism, because a lot of the infrastructure, for example, state highways, etc., are not just the assets of the center. Similarly, a lot of the areas that have been included, including food and public distribution, housing and urban affairs, the states have a lot of stake in that, both in terms of investment and in terms of policy. So I do not understand how such an announcement can even be made without consulting the states and bringing them into the conversation. Okay. And we have seen different such attempts in the past. We have seen in the early 2000s how the attempt to uh, privatize electricity in UP failed. We saw what happened to the PPP model of water privatization in Tamil Nadu. And so what happened to, and if we take international example, the what happened to the railway nationalization, denationalization, privatization in the UK, and they're now being forced to renationalize parts of it. So all of this actually shows that this move is sinister. And the reason I say is sinister, because once you compare this with what has been happening recently in terms of the centralization of corporate profits, of just 20 companies accounting for more than 65% of corporate profits in financial year 2022, 21, 22, and it was even larger the year before, 72%. It is a way of, as Sridhar pointed out from his Air India example, it is basically handing over national assets which were to be used for the use of the people to to the corporate sector for a song. And so the sort of transfer, the resource transfer that will take place through this is basically handing over the corporate sector the entire public sector infrastructure for or free, to the extent that the likely investment, as Sridhar says, is going to be very, very less. So I'll stop here.
uh, Professor Chirushri Dasgupta, you raised several points, and I'm going to ask Shurajit Majumdar to elaborate on some of these points. I think the main point, which he's repeatedly emphasizing, that this government is ideologically motivated in a manner which says public sector always has to be bad and inefficient, and private sector necessarily has to be good. But in the process, what is happening, to use Chirushri's language, a sinister move to transfer resources essentially that belongs to the people of this country to a bunch of oligarchs. I'm using that language. And the whole policy of releasing assets, not only are the numbers highly inflated, but it's a form of backdoor privatization of infrastructure in this country. There are a lot of, I mean, how these assets have been valued, who are going to be the trustees of these trusts that will oversee this this kind of leasing of assets is all very, very unclear. This is a government desperate for cash and resorting to desperate means. At the end of the day, problems of unemployment, problems of recovery will not be resolved. And I must add one point before I come to you, Surajit, and this should be very clear to all those who are viewing this program. Center for Financial Accountability made several attempts to speak with people who do not agree with the three of you ideologically. Spokespersons of the government, economists of the government, people who are otherwise, who justify everything that the government is doing, or at least justify some of the programs and policies of the government. And I must tell you, despite several attempts and several attempts to contact these individuals, I don't want to name them. I know I personally passed on the telephone numbers to those who are working in the Center for Financial Accountability. They were not interested in a debate. They were sometimes impolite in telling them we are not interested. So, in a sense, the government doesn't even want to discuss anything, whether it be the farm laws, whether it be the national monetization pipeline, etc., etc. I stop. Surajit, over to you.
Thank you, Paranjoy. Sridhar and Chirushri have already highlighted some of the key features of what is really behind this national monetization pipeline. I'd like to begin with what you said, that the supposed ideological slant of this current regime where it seems to argue that the public sector is inherently inefficient and private sector is inherently efficient, as a cover for handing over public assets or national assets to the private sector. I'd go a little beyond that in saying that it's also a cover for a reality which is actually the exact opposite. Because what you are seeing in the form of this national asset monetization pipeline is yet another instance of big private capital being rewarded not for having delivered on its commitments, but for having reneged on that commitments. Repeatedly, we have been seeing this scenario where the private sector or private big capital reneges on its commitments, and in the name of inducing private investment, in the name of promoting investment, they are rewarded for that reneging. So for a long period of time, we have had an economic policy framework in which which sector of the economy is placed at the center of that process as the one which leads any growth and development process. That has been private capital, and private big capital in specific. That they are the wealth creators, they are the job creators, they are the employment creators. So policy has to be designed towards encouraging them to invest and grow the economy, to create wealth. This is the commitment. This is the framework in which economic policy is being. The reality is what? That at least for 10 years now, you've seen this investment has been stagnating. They have not invested. They may talk about the great future of India, but they're not investing in that future. We have had a scenario where employment opportunities, in any case very limited, have been shrinking. Employment proportion as a total, the proportion of the working age population has been declining. So you place them on an elevated status that they will drive the growth and development process. You gave them several benefits and concessions in the name of that, including tax concessions, other kinds of concessions. You can get land cheaply, you can get other things cheaply, but they have not delivered in terms of even investment, which is maybe for their own profit, forget about employment and growth, for a long period of time. It is not 1 year, 2 years, it is more than 10 years that this story has been enacted. The idea of pushing growth through private investment has gone so far in India that even in the last decade, you said even for infrastructure development, which even in the most private-oriented economies often is considered to be an area where public sector investment is important. You went to the extent of saying that no, even that area will be led by the private sector. You made public sector banks finance what was supposedly private sector investment in infrastructure, and you landed up in this decade with the problem of non-performing assets in the public sector banks, for which now their public ownership character is being blamed. That's the reason why they are in the having this particular problem. Now, when that process also fails, what do? You say, okay, we wanted private sector to invest. We wanted them to also invest in infrastructure. They couldn't do that. Okay, so let what the public sector has invested, the assets created by that, let's give it to them to operate. And investment business, if at any has to be done, whatever measly amount they give to us, we'll direct that towards investment and asset creation. So public sector will bear the burden of the risk of investing first in any particular asset. Once that asset becomes something which can pay, which is therefore attractive, they have no shame in even using that kind of language in the documents of the thing. It is attractive to investors. Then you say, take these and operate them. And when you have milked these assets to the maximum possible extent and they have been run down, they have kept the possibility of getting any return out of them have been fully squeezed out, then you can hand over whatever is left of that asset back to the public sector. So this is not in any way a policy of designed to influence investment. This is in fact rewarding big private capital for not having invested. So you're just this is part of a long chain of things where every time you justify a policy as a policy which is designed to encourage investment, and when the private sector doesn't invest, you say we need to do more in order to encourage that private investment. So without making an investment, without creating new assets, you are going to be rewarded with cornering a larger and larger share of whatever asset base exists. So public sector assets will also be handed over to you, but this is also part of other of a policy mix in which other the parts of the assets, even private sector assets, which may not be with the big private capital, you create conditions where they can corner those assets also. So they basically eat up everything in the economy, or larger and larger concentration in their hands. And this, of course, doesn't address the fundamental problem. The reason why they don't invest is they don't expect to be making money out of fresh investments. And they don't expect to be making money out of fresh investments because, having cornered most of the economy in their own hands, they've left very little for anyone else to give rise to any kind of a demand. And if the state also starts handing over more and more assets to them and doesn't choose to spend or invest out of actually taxing them, then you're only furthering this process more and more. So it's like digging yourself into a deeper and deeper hole in the name of trying to get yourself out of a crisis. So I think that this is the way I would look at what this particular policy is when I place it in the context of what has been happening for more than a decade. Okay, and of course it has been accelerated with the current government. Its whole approach is also of that kind, and you are seeing this continuous process of no economic expansion, no expansion of opportunities, no asset creation, no employment creation by big private capital, being rewarded by letting them take over. So you don't have to expand, you just take over what is there more and more. That's the process that is actually underway, and this asset monetization pipeline I see as an integral element of such a process.
Thank you so much, Professor Surojit Majumdar, for categorically stating that you see this entire chain of, or the sequence of events, which has been going on for several years now, as you say, almost a decade, but which the process which has got a certain amount, which has been accelerated or intensified, especially over the last, post-pandemic, over the last year and a half or two. What we see is that the private sector is being, according to you, rewarded for reneging on its commitments to invest, to create jobs, to create assets. And if I may say, though you haven't used this language, it's almost like a scorched earth policy. I mean, you are destroying as soon as you see you don't have any other way forward. And I would like Sridhar to not only highlight or add to what has been already said by Professor Majumdar, Professor Chirashri Dasgupta, but to compare the changes that has happened. We know that during the Vajpayee government from 1998, for almost 6 years till 2004, there was an active privatization policy. The government preferred to call it disinvestment. They call it strategic sales. We know what happened in the case of Centaur Hotel, various hotels, etc., etc. But even some of the individuals who were ardent proponents of that policy, say, I'll give you one example, Minister Arun Shourie, who's now a bitter critic of the present regime. And in fact, he himself has said that maybe that's not the right policy we should have followed. And we know how he's being summoned to court, etc., 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 for alleged acts of corruption in these privatization programs. But the short point is, what really has changed? Even the Vajpayee government was ideologically pro-private sector, very, very much. Are we now seeing, after the Modi government comes to power, what is, according to you, the big changes in policies and programs that mark what has happened in the last year or a year and a half? Please unmute yourself before you speak, Sridhar.
Yeah. The most striking thing as a journalist, I was in Balco in 2001 when Balco was sold for a song for 550 crores. This was an entire township, not just a plant. It had a power plant to go with the aluminium plant. It was sold for a song 550 crores, and it was a huge scandal. And there was an outcry, and the government was forced to engage in some kind of damage limitation exercise, although it went ahead. Subsequently, when they tried to sell BPCL, this is an anecdote I'm relating from my own professional experience. BPCL privatization was opposed from the source from very close to the government. Actually, gave me
Absolutely.
access to documents.
I'm just elaborating. When you say BPCL, you're talking about Bharat Petroleum Corporation Limited.
Absolutely.
And also, absolutely. Please continue.
Yes.
Please continue.
So there was Soli Sarabji, who was then Solicitor General to the government, got in touch and said this is unconstitutional because it is a separate special act of parliament. Bharat Petroleum was created by a special act of parliament, and this cannot be done. It can't be sold like this. And so there were objections within the government. You can't imagine that under the Modi regime. That's a very striking thing. And the pace of privatization certainly stalled. And they tried to privatize Nalco, for instance. It met with stiff resistance and it was stopped. They tried to privatize parts of the Neyveli Lignite Corporation. It was stopped. So several of these suffered a setback in that time, because the Vajpayee government did not enjoy that kind of majority in parliament as the Modi government now enjoys, and nor did it risk gutting its own future by taking such a risk. So that is a very striking difference between then and now. Here the scale of privatization is just humongous. It's just coming at you in a tidal wave. These waves of privatization, I mean, what they are embarking on is not bits and pieces of companies here and there. It is, I mean, you just look at the companies that are now on the anvil within this financial year. There is Shipping Corporation of India, which is the leading shipping company, I mean, the public sector company in India. It enjoys a significant market share. Then there is Concor, which even when you're deciding to sell the company, it has a profit margin of something like 40%. You're just handing it on a platter to a private interest. And then there is these Rashtriya Ispat Nigam, the Visakhapatnam steel plant, and so on. So these are now there. But the most outrageous one of the lot is the privatization of LIC. I mean, we'll come to that a little later, but this is in brief. This is the difference between now and then. I mean, the Vajpayee government could not have imagined privatizing LIC. To just tell you how outrageous the whole notion is, LIC was not even a company when Nirmala Sitharaman announced the decision to privatize in her last budget. How can you privatize something that you don't even own? I mean, I just wanted to highlight the case of LIC to make this point, that this is completely brazen, the scale and the enormity of the asset sale that is being planned.
May I just interrupt you and play devil's advocate, Sridhar?
Yeah.
I'm playing devil's advocate to say that, look, what is the government's logic? The Life Insurance Corporation has arguably, it's one of the biggest repositories of money that at the end of the day belongs to the people of this country. And this is long-term money that can be used for projects with long gestation time. What's wrong in having an initial public offering where you give a certain amount of money, in a sense, to individual small private individuals as well as corporate bodies? And so what's wrong? You're still going to retain control over the biggest life insurer. We know we had a big sort of a debate during the Vajpayee government on bringing in foreign direct investment in insurance, but this is the justification that's being given.
Okay.
Please
Okay.
continue.
For this, you must appreciate that the LIC is sui generis in the world of finance. There is not a single insurer anywhere in the world which is comparable to the Life Insurance Corporation. Let me tell you why. The government investment in LIC, when it was set up, the equity base was 5 crores. It has not put in a single pie over these more than 50 years. When the equity base was expanded in 2011 to 100 crores, the entire money came from within the LIC. So it is just a book transfer. So no, the point about LIC is this. The LIC, the reason it was successful was because it had a certain character. It was perceived as a government company. It was backed by a sovereign guarantee which was never invoked in all these years. So there was an implicit backing of the government which assured people and motivated people to seek life insurance in a country of extreme poverty. Now, that is, if you say that you're going to do it's only a marginal dilution of sale. The point is that is no longer legally compatible with a government guarantee, because it is no longer a government undertaking, in which the government holds the entire stake. So legally, that is no longer the case. So when that happens, you can't assume that this insurance industry will grow at the rate at which has been growing. Without LIC, you could not have had insurance penetration of the kind we have seen, and it's a magnificent achievement. So what you are going to do is not only destroy LIC in the process, but you are going to subvert the progress of life insurance in India, whereby people can have an affordable way of insuring themselves. And if you look at the ticket size of LIC policies, they are very, very much smaller than those of the private insurers who are there. The other important thing, one very important characteristic of LIC is that 95% of the LIC as a matter of policy, was rewarding its policy holders to the extent of 95% of all profits they were plowed back to the policy holders. Whereas in the private industry is demanding that it be 10%. In fact, the law has been amended to make it share 10% of its profits. Now that means it is no longer attractive to people to invest in LIC. In the name of causing a level playing field, you are actually destroying this life insurance business in India. Yeah, Paranjoy.
Yeah. So would you like to add to anything that has already been said by Professor Chirashree Dasgupta and Surajit Majumdar? Then we can sort of move on to another theme.
No, I just wanted to highlight a bit about this railway privatization business.
Please go on.
Some of the assets that are now on the block are assets that the railways have invested in the last 10-15 years. Like, for example, take the dedicated freight corridor. The dedicated freight corridor has been undertaken. It has been built. It is already functional in parts. It has been built with significant expenditure. Now, when it is sold, these revenues will no longer be flowing into the railways coffers. So its capacity to invest in additional, there's a huge backlog, by the way, of railway investment needs. There is a huge capacity constraint in the Indian Railways. for which the government has not been investing adequately, and particularly the Narendra Modi government has been worse in this respect. That is one. I just wanted to highlight this thing about the state of the existing capacity. Same with the oil pipelines. Indian Oil and GAIL and other companies have invested in the pipelines expecting revenues to come from them. Now, if you just hive it off and pass it off to somebody else, Indian Oil is going to get hurt, GAIL is going to get hurt, because it's not going to see revenues coming from those projects.
All right. I think you made very, very important points, Sridhar. And essentially, the point you're making is even the manner in which these assets are being sought to be leased, monetized, privatized, you're just picking. You are literally cherry picking those assets which are most profitable for the private sector and immiserizing and literally hollowing out the productive sections of the public sector. Professor Chiroshri, would you like to add anything? And then I'll move to Professor Surajit. And otherwise, we can move on to another topic after this.
I just wanted to point out a different aspect to this, which is that if you look at India since 1991, or if you want to look at India since the 1950s, okay, when the whole process of planning and like a more regulated economy was introduced, whenever there is talk of infrastructure, whether it was government or private, it's always been nodal infrastructure, which is like these big projects, etc. But the one thing that has never been looked at in India by any government seriously is what is called arterial infrastructure, that you connect, like building of village roads, of creating drinking water capacity, etc. This kind of this is apart from electrification, there has not been any kind of development of infrastructure that can be considered arterial as priority of any government. Okay. And even today, when they are talking about whether it is by the reason that we don't have this is partly to do with, or wholly to do with, what we've been discussing before, and which is the question of when infrastructure itself becomes a way of primary accumulation by big capitalists to just sort of suck out from the economy whatever has already been created. And hence there is nothing that is left which can then be used to really develop arterial infrastructure as well as social infrastructure. So because we have been talking about the last 2-3 years, if you see that, I don't know, I think we will discuss MSMEs separately, so I'm not going
No,
into that.
we will discuss it.
Okay. So, but if you look at one of the things that is in the last 2 years is clear is the total collapse of health infrastructure, which is the most privatized, one of the most privatized social infrastructure in India. And not the bid is, so this thing about handing over everything to private capital is not merely limited to large physical infrastructure, but also to social infrastructure through the new economic policy, for example, in the case of education, and the simply allowing the collapse of the public health infrastructure by underfunding and underinvestment in the last so many years. I just wanted to add this.
I think you highlighted a very, very important point, Shiroshi Rajgupta. I mean, these figures are known. We've discussed them. I mean, the pathetic public investments in healthcare has been, it's so obvious today, especially in the COVID, post-COVID, and the way in which the whole education, our investments in education is also been very, very I mean, these are all very well known. And then why are people surprised that, hello, Bangladesh seems to be doing better than us? It's a great hurt to our quote unquote national ego. Shurajit, would you like to add to any of the points? And maybe we can from here move on to a related theme. And this is this whole dependence on not just privatization, but foreign direct investment. I'll just before I come to this point, say coal mining. Just one example. June 2020, peak COVID. Suddenly, India opens the coal mining sector to commercial operations by private industry. Coal extracted from mines identified for auction under the process can now be freely utilized, not just for private captive consumption, but for general sale or even export. And before this, all those end-use restrictions have been removed. Now, when you look at the other way, and in coal, it's also there, foreign investments. In 2020, India changed its foreign direct investment regulations to allow investments of up to 74% in defense, in the defense equipment manufacturing sector under the automatic route. This was earlier 49%. This is an important decision for a sector that is even today struggling to attract investment. And we've already talked about insurance and the life insurance policy, but you've done exactly the same thing. You passed an insurance amendment bill to permit 74% FDI in insurance companies against the existing cap of 49%. And all of this is ostensibly in the name of the ease of doing business. Professor Shurajit Majumdar, your views. You'll have to unmute yourself. Yes, please.
Yeah, even more than the ease of doing business, the sharp contradiction that one can see is between these and the idea of atmanirbhar bharat. Okay, that only in India could we think of calling a policy atmanirbhar, of promoting atmanirbhar bharat, where you increase the FDI limits to 74% in defense and insurance. How that can be reconciled with the idea of atmanirbharta is something that beats me. But I think I'd like to link this to the question that you posed to Sridhar about what's the difference between now and earlier. And that difference is that I think the transition that has happened is that the idea of government and state economic policy supporting private capital in a process of economic expansion, okay, has been, as that process has come undone, exhausted itself, you have increasingly a transition to a scenario where the government is expected to support private capital in cornering more and more of the assets of the economy instead of creating assets in a process of expansion. And this transition, this is an economic transition that has happened, also necessitates a far more authoritarian context, because of course the contradictions between this process and almost all other segments of society become much sharper. And what the post 2014 regime has offered is that far more authoritarian kind of regime, which can think at least that it can push all of these through. Okay. That it does not always succeed is something that is proved by the fact that the farm laws have had to be repealed by even this regime. But the notion or the idea that this regime can actually push it through is the reason why even big capital has gravitated and stuck with this regime, even though you can see several signs that the economy is in quite a state of shambles. So I think that's the transition that has happened, and therefore, on the one hand, you get a bigger push towards this privatization and acquisition. And there's an added element to that, which is this, that when you are interested in expansion of production, etc., and all of that, you want certain benefits, certain kinds of supports to come from the state. Okay, so good infrastructure development by the state is something that can also be helpful to private investment when it is interested in investing in expansion. But as the scope for that shrinks, as you move more and more towards looking to acquire assets, almost every sector becomes something that where using that sector to, using it to acquire assets or using it to earn profits becomes far more important than the services that it may offer to private capital investing in other sectors. This is true of education. There's little interest in education except as a profit-making sector, because frankly speaking, the kind of expansion that is taking place, the number of people that you actually require, and the kind of training that they require is so limited that consideration as to what's going to happen to the quality of the education system is of little concern to big private capital now, even though it might be wanting to employ the products of the higher education sector. So across different sectors, there is little concern about what's going to happen to the quality of education. What is more important is how much profit can be made out of that particular sector. And the same applies to most of these other sectors and infrastructure sectors. So you are having a transition from a situation where public sector presence in certain sectors was in a sense supportive of private investment or expansion in other sectors, to one in which whatever areas are still under the public sector simply become areas on which you want to poach more and more, because you no longer expect that other kind of role to be played by that sector.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Surojit Majumdar. Let me come once again to Sridhar. Sridhar, this is linked. Linked. It got into my head because I'm going to talk about production linked incentive. Yes, it's linked to what Professor Surojit Majumdar says. And they've been introduced across several key sectors, ostensibly to create what are called manufacturing champions, national manufacturing champions, like we have champions in javelin throw and wrestling and so on and so forth. And this is supposed to be creating employment opportunities for our youth. We know how young a country India is. It's a separate matter that India will soon overtake China in terms of the number of people, the population, the total population. But we know that about half the population of India, roughly half the population of India, is below the age of 26 or 27 or whatever. So all this is being done in the name of creating jobs for the youth. And let me quote what Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has said. She has gone on record saying, and this is all linked to the atmanirbhar bharat scheme to make India self-reliant, self-sufficient. And she said, Ms. Sitharaman says, the objective is to make India a bigger and more important part of the global economy by pursuing policies that are efficient, competitive, and resilient. What do these words mean? Your views. And please unmute yourself. Yes.
This PLI scheme is very different from similar exercises undertaken in several of the East Asian countries and elsewhere in the world, in the sense that the state provides an ecosystem for manufacturing capability. Instead, this PLI is basically a set of bunch of incentives meant to make it profitable, and it is very unlikely that these will have a long-lasting effect. Especially once those incentives are no longer viable or not available. So that is one. Secondly, this kind of contracting out, farming out of activities to private industry based on incentives is very likely to lead to very perverse incentives for industry. For example, there is not far from Bangalore, there was this Apple's manufacturing facility in which wages were not paid for months together to employees, many of them women, and there was a massive
a big protest.
Yes, and there was a massive retaliation from the workers. They smashed up the working place, and it was completely outrageous what this Apple's contractor was doing. Now the PLI is something like this, in the sense that you are incentivizing. All you are doing is you are providing a bunch of incentives to these companies to make something. In what are these called? Whatever these are called, champions and so on. And it is very unlikely that they will emerge competitive in the long run anyway, because an ecosystem for this doesn't exist. I'll just talk about the state of the vaccine capacity, for instance, to make this point. Our complete dependence on two manufacturers for our vaccines, without developing an ecosystem. There are many private small biotech companies which have capabilities to produce vaccines, but they don't have the scale. Many of them were incubated by the Department of Biotechnology years ago, and so it would make much better sense for the state to initiate and state to take charge of these activities. You provide an ecosystem, you set the discipline, you make sure that private capital delivers, you provide an enabling framework. That's it. You don't allow yourself. It's like the tail wagging the dog. That's what is happening in this PLI.
Okay. Would you like to add anything to what Sridhar has said, Professor Chirushri Dashgupta? It's essentially this whole idea that we are creating these national champions, like javelin champions and badminton champions, that they're going to create jobs. But what we are actually seeing is far from making India atmanirbhar. The reverse is happening. Far from creating jobs at a very, very rapid pace, which India needs given its young population, we don't see adequate investments and therefore not seeing adequate job creation. So your views on this whole PLI scheme, the production linked incentive scheme, which is supposed to be one of the big, a major scheme which the government is touting. Yes.
Well, first of all, if you look at what is the allocation for this scheme, okay, which is a measly 1.97 lakh crores, okay, out of which 57,000 crores are promised to the automobile sector alone. So the rest 9 sectors which have been added later will hardly get any substantive kind of support. So there are these grand announcements, but they're not backed up by even the minimum amount of investment that is needed to make these at least functional and sustainable. And that brings me to the question that I was referring to earlier, that if you just don't look at PLI in itself, but for example, look at what has happened to the MSME sector as a whole, which is one of the prime sort of supposed targets of this scheme, what you find is that first demonetization and then GST had already destroyed a large number of firms in this sector. There were firms which had gone bust. There were stories of suicide of entrepreneurs, if you remember, a few years ago. And then subsequently, COVID really created havoc. Now, in this situation,
I'm briefly interrupting you, Chirushri. I don't know what these statistics really mean, but according to the data released by the NCRB, the National Crimes Record Bureau, more businessmen are supposed to have committed suicide than farmers. I'm just putting out what has come in the media. Yes,
I
please
mean, I
continue.
don't know the veracity of that, because one of the problems is that women farmers' suicide is not recorded as farmer suicide. It's recorded as women's suicide. So that could kind of tweak the figures. But it's true that businessmen have committed suicide, and these are all small operators. I mean, no big capitalist in India has had to commit suicide so far.
With
So
one
what?
exception, perhaps. With one exception, perhaps the person from Kerala, the cafe coffee day person.
Oh yeah, true. But then he's not as big as the kind of scale that we see with the top 20 that we are talking about, and especially the
The
top
oligarchs. The oligarchs.
products. Yeah. So, in the situation, if you now see that there are several things that have been put out. So, there was the emergency credit guarantee loan scheme, which was also put out, which once again, if you see the amount, initially it was 3 lakh crores, and then it was increased to 4.5 lakh crores, out of which, till date, according to the minister in the current session of parliament, only 2.82 crores have been sanctioned, and there is no data about the actual disbursement. So sanction is 50%. So disbursement will be even less, maybe 25% is my guess. Okay, it's a reasonable guess. So under these circumstances, that apart from the fact that there is that there is a lot of uh, mm, pomp and sort of show about these grand announcements, the actual working of these schemes on the ground are far from what is being announced. So even if we take that component of Atmanirbhar Bharat and not look at the larger implications which others have talked about, Shurajit has put it very succinctly, and so has Sridhar. But even if we look at these components, which were supposed to, it's just not enough. And if you don't put in enough, as Sridhar has been saying, that just if you look at the kind of uh, government infrastructure support and the kind of policies that was followed by East Asia, and that was also by authoritarian governments, if we want to put that parallel here. That so if but the main difference, I think, is that the state there could control the capitalist class, while in the case of India it is the capitalist class which is controlling the state. So
And
this
in case,
is
the nexus is strengthened thanks to the legacy of former finance minister who's now no longer with us, Mr. Arun Jaitley, the electoral bonds scheme,
absolutely,
which the Supreme Court
absolutely.
is yet to hear about its legality. So the quid pro quo and the nexus between big business and politics. I mean, what we do certainly know that almost the lion's share, as they would say, or the bulk of the money that's coming through these non-transparent electoral bonds have gone to the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party.
Absolutely. So that itself, so in that sense, what we have here is a kind of a sort of almost what is called a uh, like a some kind of a sop to the MSMEs to keep them from, because there is a lot of uh, uh, disconcerting developments within the MSME sector, which is actually potentially also dangerous for the BJP in terms of its political base. But at the same time, so there are certain SOPs being announced periodically in the name of Atmanirbhar Bharat, but together in substantive terms, it does not add up to much. But why they manage to still keep going and doing this is primarily for two reasons. Of course, the farmer struggle has shown that this strategy can also fail. But one of the things is that this aura of authoritarianism, that you can push through anything, is something that has been sort of trumpeted by the media in building that kind of an image. And the second is that the thorough communalization of the polity and to that extent, a depoliticization of the economic question, as if the economic question is the realm of experts, with the great leader being the best expert on this, and then others need not bother about it. They just need to bother about whether Hindu khatre mein hai ya nahi. This kind of a divisive thing, which kind of puts a veil over the real questions, the real structural questions in terms of the daily lives of the people, of livelihood, of employment, the things that we are talking about. So in that sense, Atmanirbhar Bharat is that big veil that has been put
Okay.
over all these questions.
Okay, you raised several points, and I'm going to add to one or two points you made and ask Professor Surajit Majumdar to react on a day when the Supreme Court tells the advocate for the Uttar Pradesh government, who claimed that pollution in this country and the capital is because of the fumes coming across the border from Pakistan, which prompted the Chief Justice of India to say we can't do anything about the industries in Pakistan. But on a more substantive note, Shurajit, there are several points that Chirashri has raised. Now, this broadening on the definition of what is a micro enterprise, what is a small enterprise, what is a medium enterprise, is also supposed to be a part of this whole ease of doing business policy of the government. But there are two aspects. Much of the so-called, policies and decisions of the government has been essentially aimed at providing loans, credit, including credit to medium and small and medium enterprises, micro, small and medium enterprises. And essentially you have increased the thresholds at which people can take loans, credit guarantee schemes for subordinate debt, and essentially the scheme provides for 20,000 crore worth of subordinate debt for roughly 200,000, 2 lakh micro, small and medium enterprises, which the assets are stressed assets or they are non-performing assets, essentially companies which are sick. Now, bank is supposed to provide the subordinate debt to promoters of such small enterprises equal to 15% of the promoter's existing stake and subject to a minimum of 75 lakh rupees and more additional funding. They are announcing 3 lakh crore loan relief. Now, the point that I'm going to ask you, that these programs, then MSEs will not have to provide guarantee, collateral to avail of these benefits. Will it really help? And why is it so important? Because everybody knows that it is this segment of the economy, this sector of the economy, micro enterprises, small enterprises, medium enterprises, that have been creating jobs. And this sector of the economy has been very, very badly hit by the recession post-COVID. Please, your views.
Well, I think, as Chirashri was saying, that there is a kind of trumpeting of what is being done when it is not actually backed up by any substantive commitments in terms of expenditure. I think if you look at all this set of policies which are about promoting credit or credit waiver or making it easier to get access to credit, production-linked incentive schemes, etc., all of these are, apart from the fact that they are not significant in terms of what change they bring about at the ground level, are also ways and means of trying to show that you are doing something when you are not actually willing to do what is the real requirement or where the real problem lies. So you are supposedly promoting a policy in which you are trying to help enterprises which are unable to help enterprises expand production, expand employment, improve their financial health, without asking the question, why are they first in that situation? Okay. Now, at the moment, it seems that it is COVID and all the associated things that have happened with it that have resulted in that particular problem. But firstly, this problem predates COVID. It predates even even demonetization, which is that you simply do not have adequate demand available within the economy, or what export markets are able to offer you, where and if and when you can be competitive. Enough demand to sustain this expanding an expansion of production. The when in that situation you further aggravated the problem with measures like demonetization, GST, and then in the effect of COVID also exaggerated by the inept way in which it was handled, the result of which was a severe economic contraction combined with a disaster as far as controlling the spread of the infection itself was concerned. Now, if all of this has resulted in devastating a demand situation that was already adverse or poor, then unless you address that fundamental problem, how can you address this issue? Now, that addressing that fundamental problem requires at the minimum a willingness to expand expenditure by the state. But what are we seeing? We are seeing the exact opposite. So you do not expand expenditure. Okay, if at all you do something, you give concessions on the tax sides, and that becomes a pretext then, because you're going to say lose some revenue, that becomes a pretext to further cut down expenditure. So no attempt at even increasing expenditure, which is the minimum requirement, not a sufficient condition for addressing the problem of at demand level that exists in the Indian economy. And you are not willing to even increase expenditure in ways which will enable even firms to be competitive in a global market, which is in any case not in a very healthy situation at the moment. The experience we have of the last 10 years is, I mean, fundamentally, what was the difference between the idea of make in India and all of this that is happening now? Make in India was what? We have very cheap labor. It's an attractive place to produce, therefore we'll make it easier to do business here, less costly to set up a business and to produce, and for the not only the Indian market, for the world market. What is the effect that it had? What is the result that we see? We see no increase in exports for 10 years. We see no investment increase for 10 years. And we see a manufacturing sector in India which is progressively shrinking relative to the entire economy. That's the phenomena for the last 10 years. And so why is it that you're actually seeing this long history? You will not look at that. You will not see the evidence that stares you in the face that this attempt at trying to push manufacturing, to push exports, to push growth by simply addressing questions of credit and incentives on the supply side is simply not working. You have this mountain of evidence in front of you, but if you don't wish to see it and respond according to what that evidence tells you, then this is the scenario that you're going to be in. I describe it as a situation in which India's policymakers have decided that we are going to keep digging ourselves into a deeper and deeper and deeper hole in the vain hope that at some point of time we'll strike gold. We are digging, we don't find gold, we dig further. We still don't find gold, we dig even further. And we still don't find gold, and we are go on doing it in the hope that at some point of time we'll strike gold. And if in between there are other things that happen, rainwater comes in, landslides happen, something like COVID effects comes, if we sink in that, if we can raise our head a little, we say we've recovered, forgetting the fact that we are sinking into a deeper and deeper hole. That's the reality of so all the talk will be about we are doing this, and you can get anything can be described in great detail, and you can on paper draw a causal link between that and a result. But has anyone made an assessment of several such schemes and policies that have been said will produce this result? Where is the result? Where is the result? At the end of the day, you neither get investment, you neither get industrial development. You have 1 decade of manufacturing growth, output stagnation. There is only one previous decade in the history of independent India where you had similar story, and that is referred to as the stagnation decade after 1965. No other period in India's post-independence history has seen such a poor industrial growth performance as the last 10 years. You don't want to see the evidence. You want to fiddle with GDP and somehow find a story that no, things are all well. So all the evidence that is there, investment as a proportion of GDP declining, trade as a proportion of GDP declining, construction boom over, industrial growth stagnating, employment as a proportion of the population declining, you have evidence that large sections of the population either don't have work, and what they earn from that work gives them very little. Self-employed persons 10 to 12,000 rupees a month. Agricultural households 10,000 rupees a month from all sources. Casual labor less than 300 rupees a day when they get any work. Regular employment also not more than 16,000. Of that also, many of us who are in formal sector employment and higher salary push that level up. You look at the large majority, industrial workers, 14,000 rupees a month average monthly income, salary. And this is the state of, and you see the wages stagnating for a long period of time. All this is there in front of you, staring you in the face. That you talk about a population of 135 crores, more than 100 crore people are in this kind of a state. If you are not going to do, and you're in addition having additional change, that people were poor earlier, but when they were largely rooted in the rural agricultural economy, apart from natural factors, there was some degree of stability or certainty in their lives. That is also disappearing. So in addition to income stagnation is increasing economic uncertainty that large majority face. With that as the nature of the Indian market, who will, so our big capitalists are very smart. They know they are not going to make money by investing in creating new productive capacities. So they're not interested in that. And they voted with their money about what is the state of the Indian economy. Don't say go by what statements they make in the association statements and all of that. What have they said with their money? Where have they put in money to expand productive and employment capacity of the economy in 10 years? They haven't done that. And they won't still do it. All schemes, etc., to the extent that it benefits them, it will help them to increase the profit out of whatever existing activity they do. It's not going to make them invest anymore, because if there's no demand, there's no market, there's no scope for them to make a higher return. And if you do nothing to expand that market, to initiate any process of expansion, and you let that fragile household economy of majority of Indians get battered and battered and battered with everything, demonetization, GST, COVID, lockdown, and you do nothing to put it on a surer footing, then this is going to be the result. So it is, in a sense, creating economic devastation on which then the big corporate vultures can feed and take over larger and larger part of the economy. That's the only way I can describe it.
I mean, those analogies have been very, very stark. In fact, digging and digging and digging and digging deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper in the hope you find your oil or you find your gold, and hoping that something will come out of the blue. You have highlighted and flagged and reiterated an issue which all of you have been highlighting over our discussion, the issue of demand and the demand. And we haven't really talked about inflation, but how much of that inflation has been really cost push and how much has been the demand pull. And it has been argued in more than one place that the inflation that we are seeing is really largely a cost push inflation, and much of it, or a fair amount of it, because of petroleum products. And then when the ruling party does badly in the elections or anticipates a bad outcome in the forthcoming assembly elections, suddenly petrol prices and diesel prices come down and the farm laws are abrogated. And it's interesting what you said, Shurajit, about the mountain of evidence which is being ignored. And I am reminded of, if I'm not mistaken, it's a biblical statement, but I'm not sure I'll be standing corrected. There are none so blind as those who will not see. And let me move on, in a sense, to the last theme of what we are discussing. Linked to this whole ease of doing business is the big corporate tax cuts that went before COVID by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. And I quote her here. She says, measures have been undertaken to promote ease of doing business with rational tax systems, simple and clear laws, reducing the compliance burden. And then we know a recent initiative of the government to scrap the retrospective tax law, which would help resolve tax. And according to the government of India and the finance minister, it will boost investor confidence. We know there was a background to this particular discussion, and we know about the Vodafone case and the Cairn Energy case, and India, in international tribunals and courts, India's position not being, vindicated by courts of law and outside India. So I'm here asking all, we have a few questions which have been, one question I know which has been also raised. So let me also put that question. And this is also linked to this ideological debate that, or the government's ideology, which is being given more sort of emphasis than anything else. And that question is, are there any examples of firms or enterprises where we've seen collective ownership doing well, surviving in India? So I'm raising this question. This question has been, there have been a lot of people on the chat box who've praised your views and have appreciated the points you've made, and so people have sort of argued on many of these points. So I'd like you, at this juncture, we have still about 20 minutes. So it would be good if all three of you sort of, maybe I'll reverse the order. I'll start with you, Shurajit, go to Chirashri, and then to Sridhar. Some of the points I mentioned, and this whole, and let these be also your closing remarks on this discussion that we've had.
Okay. Now, as far as the question of collective ownership is concerned, I would say that in any case, successful, I think Sridhar spoke about LIC. LIC itself is a publicly owned entity, is a remarkable story in itself. But of course, in general, even when we talk about big capital, there are, of course, business families who control these vast empires, but it's not their money that is invested in it. Largely belongs to us. So they are also, in a sense, kind of collectively owned. But I'll leave it to others to speak more about it, because I want to just emphasize one point which sums up some of the things that we were talking about, which is that if you look at this current financial year, we have data now up to October. If you look at the central government's expenditure, how that has changed compared to not only last year, but even 2019-20, the same period of the year, which is April to October, then you'll find that compared to last year, the actual expenditure is only about little less than 10% more than last year, and it is almost the same level higher than 2019-20. So only a 10% increase in the total expenditure of the central government compared to 2019-20. Okay, even though the level of inflation in this period, the increase in prices has been higher than 10%. So in real terms, the government of India, Union government, has spent less in this year in supposedly attempting to recover from COVID than it spent in 2019-20 when it was recovering. But you look at the other side of the equation, which is what has happened to central taxes. So the center's share in central taxes compared to 2019-20 is more than 50% higher. Okay. So it is not that because the revenues have been lower, they are spending less. They are deliberately choosing to spend less and reduce the deficit rather than to do so. There is also a story about the way this more than 50% increase in center's share in taxes has happened, because this goes along with a minus 16% or a 16% reduction in the share of states. So you squeeze the states, don't let them spend, and you keep more for yourself, and you also don't spend because your interest is in trying to reduce the deficit. Okay. And where has the additional taxes come from? A significant part, of course, comes from excise duties, which are coming from basically oil and petroleum and oil products. So petrol and diesel have been the main source of a major source of the increase in taxes. But what seems to be interesting, I don't know whether this will last till the end of the year or not, but it seems to be that even corporate taxes and income taxes, personal income taxes, their increase is much higher compared to any change in the nominal GDP also. Now, this can only happen because there have been no upward revision in the rates. And certainly in this period, no massive efforts to get more tax compliance or anything in the midst of all this chaos that the economy has been facing. Nothing like that has happened. So it can only mean that the share in total income of those who pay corporate income tax, and that's a relatively small number, as Chirashri earlier indicated, and that ties up with what we know from accounts that have been placed, that without a significant increase, any change in a significant increase in sales, even profits have increased by basically cutting down on various costs, which include, of course, wage costs. So you have the sections which pay corporate tax, companies which pay account for corporate tax, and sections of the population which account for the bulk of the income tax, which are the relatively higher income groups in India, their share in income actually having increased. So you have an increase in inequality. That's what this is indicating. You have an increase in inequality that is further accentuated by levying these higher taxes on petrol and diesel, which are taxes that everyone has to eventually pay, whether they directly buy petrol or diesel or not. Okay, it's a universal tax. So you exaggerate the inequality that is happening by levying this highly regressive kind of tax. Okay, that's the wrong tax rate that they increased. And then you decide that you're going to use the revenues that you get from both these sources to cut down your fiscal deficit rather than to step up expenditure. Now, what else other than a mindless commitment to so-called fiscal conservatism can explain why this is happening when we are supposedly trying to recover from the battering that the economy has received as a result of COVID.
So thank you so much, Shurajit, for those concluding remarks, and they are very, very important. And I'm extremely happy that you flagged these issues with the articulation that you have. Professor Chirashri Dashgupta. Surajit has flagged this whole issue of an already unequal, extremely unequal society becoming even more unequal. And arguably, India is one of the most unequal countries in the world. One of the most. I mean, I'm not sure of the about the data, whether it be Brazil, whether it be South Africa, whether it be the United States. India is arguably today one of the most, one of the countries where inequalities in income and wealth have really widened and deepened. We were already a very unequal society, and we've become even more so. The second point that Surajit has flagged is this inequality. One of the reasons that has directly and indirectly contributed to this inequality is the growing dependence on indirect taxes, in particular, indirect taxes on petrol and diesel, which by their very nature are regressive, which is the opposite of progressive. Everybody has to pay the same tax, the same taxes. The whole economy, the political economy of being more centralized, less federal, squeezing the states, and all of these are resulting in, the progressive taxes, the direct taxes as a share of total tax collections has been coming down. So let's have your concluding remarks, and then I'm going to move to Sridhar.
Okay, agreeing with all that Shurajit has said, I would just like to point to two or three issues which would also address the additional questions that have come in. Let us start with some data, which is that if you look at the last few years, one of the major changes since the 1990s till date is that earlier, out of total value, about 65% in 1989 used to go for wages, and 35% of the total value created in the economy went to the surplus, out of which profits are one part after deduction of rent and interest. Today, what we have is just the opposite. 35% to 40% is wages, 60 to 65% is the of surplus share in the last 3-4 years. The second and most important data, which I often kind of reiterate, is that if in the organized manufacturing sector, as per the annual survey of industries, for every 10 rupees of value that is created in the manufacturing sector, just 18 paisa goes to labor. So labor is virtually free in India. So it is in this situation that we are talking about inequality, that to a point where the redistribution from labor to capital has intensified in such a significant way in the last 3 decades, and especially in the last 5 years, that the average level of whatever security people had has gone down to an extent where most labor, 93% of Indian labor, is in a state of precariousness. Now, in this situation, by the e-Shram registration or this new labor code, which promises some minimum degree of social security, if you look at the details and kind of decode the code, what you find is that it actually disenfranchises people who already had some amount of social security and promises barely anything, barely the minimum for others. And given the experience of past schemes like the NREGA, etc., we know that defunding and reducing, like cuts in the funding of social expenditure, has been the norm for this last 5 years. Okay, it has been there before too, but there were periods of expansion, while under this government, every year the social sector has seen cuts in real terms. So, under the circumstances, to even expect that this e-Shram registration will actually mean something concrete in terms of addressing the precariousness of people's lives is absolutely misplaced. And yes, of course, the this kind of ties in with the larger story that we've been trying to construct through this session, which is about significant redistribution of resources from the poor to the rich, from labor to capital. And basically, that is the fundamental reason for the intensification of inequality in the recent years. And hence, and this has obviously led, this is the fundamental reason, that inequality itself is the fundamental reason for the contraction of demand. And hence, what is essentially a demand side problem is just being looked at from the supply side.
That's
Shurajit
right.
said the digging holes is like absolutely the metaphor that explains it. The last point that I want to make in terms of that question about firms, enterprises with collective ownership, well, there are a few, but those are not in the corporate sector. And I will give you only one example, that of the Kudumbashri in Kerala, which has sustained over the last 2 decades, of a little more than 2 decades, and grown, and completely run by women on the model of self-help groups, but with substantive support from the state government. And so that, I think, is an example that we should look into to say, to understand what an alternative model could look like. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chirushri Dashgupta. And we don't have time to discuss the details about what the government is attempting to do now and get into the cooperative sector as well. We've seen particular cooperative organizations that have done well, including the National Dairy Development Board. What the government has in mind now, we don't know. We'll have the last words from Sridhar. Sridhar, in about 5 or 6 minutes, if you can wrap up your discussion.
Yes.
Several points have been made by Chirushri, and how do you see now the way forward? I mean, what do you see happening?
I want to pick a couple of things which Shurajit was talking about, and about the demand constraint of the Indian economy as the underlying basis for all our problems. Added to this is the fact is the nature of our small industrial base, which has been essentially parasitic. The relationship between small and big. You go to any industrial cluster. You go to, I mean, I'm very close to Hosur, where it's a perfect microcosm of all this, all kinds of units. There is Ashok Leyland, and there's several large units, but there's a whole ecosystem there. Now the entire relationship has been parasitic, and there has been never. These larger companies have never been paying their dues to the smaller units in time, and they are in a perpetual cash flow problem. Now, many of these small units are, they have their idiosyncrasies, and because of that, they bring some innovation to the practice in industry, and so they bring a lot of value to industrial production. But the relationship between large and small is essentially parasitic. Now, I want to tie this to the question of the credit-based, and the entire focus of since COVID last year has been the emphasis on credit-based or bank-based maneuvering. You are basically cajoling, begging, and asking banks to lend money. It's not happening. The problem with small industries the problem is that they are facing an insolvency crisis. They're not facing a debt crisis. They are facing an insolvency crisis where they are submerged. They're already submerged in debt, and their viability is in question. The interest rate being a little lower makes no difference to them at all. And we have continued on this dim-witted approach of trying to lower interest rates and get activity going. It's not happening. Now, if you look back since 2016, I would put the COVID crisis as part of a continuum which started with demonetization, proceeded with GST, and then with COVID, it's a continuum in which the small enterprises have been really badly hammered, and this crisis is loaded against them. And so I see, and this sets the ground for further concentration of capital, because when the small GST did the same, demonetization did the same, and the COVID lockdown had the same impact, and so there has been a prolonged crisis for the small industries. Now, in which debt is not going to focus on credit is not going to make an iota of difference to these companies. So, and that is precisely the situation in which cooperatives are discouraged. Cooperatives are no cooperative is going to get a bank funding. It does not have institutional support from the government. So to wrap it up, I think what has been happening under the Narendra Modi government is basically the pursuit of a nakedly Malthusian agenda which promotes this drive towards concentration.
Thank you so much. Thank you very, very much, Sridhar. Thank you very much, Chiroshri. Thank you very, very much, Shurajit. This has been a very, very revealing, enlightening discussion, and it has highlighted what the government doesn't want you to know. The questions that were asked have been answered. A credit-based hope for recovery will not work. You're looking for supply-side solutions to a demand-side problem which will not work. And I mean, this whole issue of unorganized workers, you have an e-shram portal and an e-shram registration, but you have gone to the extent of actually the kind of internal migration that we saw in the months of March, from 24th night of the 24th of March 2020 for the next 3 months and a little longer, was, in my opinion, unprecedented, not only in this country, in the history of this subcontinent, but perhaps in the world. And you have here a government, none other than the Solicitor General of India, quoting the Home Secretary of India, telling the Chief Justice of India there's not a single migrant worker on the highways. I mean, in my opinion, there couldn't have been a bigger lie. There have been many, many lies, and as far as the government's vision of social security, the less said, the better. So thank you so much, NewsClick. Thank you so much, Center for Financial Accountability. I thank all those who've been hearing, listening, watching this program. This will be available on YouTube, on the NewsClick website, on the NewsClick YouTube channel, as well as that of the Center for Financial Accountability. And so I thank all of you, and I'm just giving you a little heads up that we're going to have more such discussions. We've had 2 already, and now on the 6th of December and on the 10th of December, we're having 2 more discussions which will deal with the same themes that we have. So once again, it has been my honor, my privilege to moderate this panel discussion. Thank you all very much. It's exactly 5 p.m. Keep well. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.